organization in Canada, the United States, the European Union, and Israel. And Mala is really a key component of all the work that we're doing, not only in Israel, but internationally. And she's really, people who know her, a force of, positiveness and effectiveness. So it's an honor to be able, it's a privilege to work with Mala, and I know that my colleagues at ISGAP feel exactly the same way. So Mala has a BA from Barnard College in New York, from Columbia University, where she graduated cum laude, and she has a master's and PhD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she also succeeded very well in the area of international relations, and she specializes in international law. She served in the legal division at the United Nations Secretariat as part of the fellowship program, and she was a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. She's conducted research at the Davis Center on Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Her fields of expertise are wide, and they include public, international law, human rights, international organizations, diplomacy, immigration and citizenship law. She's published several books, including Multilingualism in International Law and Institutions, the multinational forces and observers in the Sinai, and significant articles on international law and the rights of minorities. She served as a member of the Israeli team at the Tabory arbitration with Egypt, and as a member of the Israeli negotiating team for the peace treaty with Jordan. Mala has academic experience at Bar Ilan and Tel Aviv universities. She's coordinated courses on the legal aspect of the Middle East peace process for American law students under the auspices of the Tel Aviv Law Faculty and Temple University Law School. She's edited the Israel Yearbook of Human Rights at Tel Aviv University in the Faculty of Law. During most of her career, Mala filled senior research and diplomatic posts in a special unit in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, involving the migration of millions of individuals from the former Soviet Union. She's currently the editor of Justice, a journal of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and the director of the Israel branch of ISGAP. And as a footnote, I think her work, particularly in the Soviet Union, she was really with a small group of people who really helped to save the lives of millions of people. And I won't get into any great detail because time is short, but I remember as a young student, as the chair of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry in North America, as Natan Sharansky said, it was students and housewives that sort of were trying to push for human rights of the former Soviet Jews. And Mala was sort of at the forefront for many, many years before the students were active, dealing with this issue and helping to really liberate a million Jews from the former Soviet Union. So amazing body of life and experience. So it's really a privilege that you're here. Thank you for coming from Israel to be with us.
Thank you, Charles, and good morning, Shalom. I am humbled and gratified to be here with you, even if it's for a very short talk. I am humbled because I have spoken with some of the lecturers in this course over the past 2 weeks, and I asked, well, what can one say and what needs completion? And they said this is an amazing group of experts, and if anything, they deserve the time to present and to share their own thoughts, because you are an exceptional group of people, each individually, and all of you together. And I'm gratified because as I heard you last night and I came today to hear you, I think that together, because you have different strengths and different backgrounds, some of which I'm familiar with and some of which not, together we can make the difference under the leadership of this amazing project that Charles conceived. Why am I humbled? Because you are each experts in your own field, and you probably know the story of the man who was rescued from the Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood of 1889, and he made a living lecturing about how he was rescued from this flood that killed 2,200 people. And that's what he did. And when he passed away, he went to heaven. And they said, there's a weekly seminar, and what would he like to lecture on? And he said, well, he'd like to lecture about how he was rescued from the Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood of 1889. And they said, maybe you could pick a different subject. And he said, no, this is how I made my living, and this is my expertise. And they said, well, okay, but you should just know that Noah is in the audience. So here I am speaking to people who know and have researched and are teaching so many fields. And as I come here to this amazing place from Israel, which is like a cauldron to this lovely intellectual environment, I know that Alice, someplace in a hole, went down, and she thought she'd come down the other side and everything would be upside down. And as I study BDS and anti-Semitism, it is an upside-down world where the victims are the perpetrators, and the anti-Semites are often the heroes and the leaders of BDS. And it's very difficult to make order in all this because it is an upside-down world. So in this short talk, I would like to do two things. First of all, to get to know you, and for you to get to know me. So as you return to your own careers and courses and activities, I will be glad with my ISGAP colleagues to help you and make available resources in areas and in languages with which perhaps you don't have access, in order to make available the vast amount of materials and research and statistics that are available as background, so that you can concentrate on the ideas and the intellectual aspects and the fight. And secondly, to share with you some of the principles and best practices that I have found work in the fight against BDS and anti-Semitism, each to be used in the relevant forum and situation. So when we come to speak of anti-Semitism, there are various narratives. And Charles told me in previous years that some lecturers come and tell stories, and some come and tell ideas. And we each have our own story that comes from our background. And I would like to start with the narrative of the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, who on June 6th in Geneva started with the following narrative. 50 years ago, this was the day that when I first heard the sound of war. I was 3.5 years old, and while fragmentary, I can still remember military men milling around our home in Amman, an armored car stationed nearby, and later planes that flew overhead. It was a war that shaped my life and forged my later desire to understand the depths of Palestinian suffering, but not only that, Jewish suffering too, the latter spanning over 2 millennia, which culminated in that colossal crime, the Holocaust. I grew up not far from the massive Palestinian refugee camp in Al-Baqa. I worked across the street from the Al-Riqat refugee camp. In the past 30 years, I have been to Auschwitz-Birkenau, visited Dachau, seen Buchenwald. I have studied in depth the trials of Nuremberg and elsewhere, the long and painful history of anti-Semitism in Europe, Russia, and later Arab countries, which remains present in far too many places around the world. Some will respond mechanically almost that the experience of the two peoples are not quite equivalent. How can I mention them in one breath? Indeed, I agree. The Holocaust was so monstrous and so mathematically planned and executed, it had no parallel, no moral equal. This statement by the former ambassador of Jordan to the United Nations, who is now the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was considered special, and he was, in the fact that he was willing to make this statement and mention the Holocaust, and then he went on to the usual diatribes of the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, but it was pointed out by our ambassador by Israel's ambassador to the United Nations institutions in Geneva, that this is a change. The fact that a UN official was willing at this venue, which was infamous for its item 7, agenda item 7, which only criticizes Israel, to talk about the Holocaust and to talk about the millennial struggle of the Jewish people against discrimination. And as you study international fora that deal with anti-Semitism and BDS, watch not only agenda item 7 at the United Nations, but also agenda item 9, where things are changing and where anti-Semitism is beginning to be mentioned. And I can talk about my own narrative and how it brought me to what I ended up doing and fighting for. My parents were in the Lodz ghetto, and the Germans during World War II said that if the Jews would give up 10,000 children, the rest of the Jews would live in peace. And so they gathered up 10,000 children on trucks. My parents had a 4-year-old daughter who was put on such a truck to a railroad, and there isn't even a day to remember when this child disappeared. My father was a slave laborer in Dachau after he went through selection in Auschwitz, and they built German armaments underground, but they didn't know what. He finished World War II, the Americans liberated him, and he was very ill and stateless. And this changed some of my attitudes toward refugees and citizenship and migration. And the Swiss government took in 50 sick people who had TB to recover after the war. So I grew up as a stateless child with crossing borders in Europe. Today it's the same. If you do not have papers on the train or on an airport, you can't go anywhere. You are nobody and you are a suspect. And this very much influenced my feelings on refugee rights. And part of what we do here, we learn the concepts, we learn the background, and then we think of how to translate them into policies. And then my parents told me that I shouldn't go back to Poland to look for cemeteries and graves because it's all one big graveyard, but look for live Jews. And I thought, where are they? And they were behind the Iron Curtain in the former Soviet Union. And so that's what I tried to do. And at a certain point, I left academic life where I would have written more articles and published more books. And I wanted to do something with the knowledge I gained. And so we fought the Soviet Union on their own grounds. We used the Helsinki agreements to convince the Soviet Union and the United Nations and international organizations that they were violating their own laws and international laws in not respecting human rights, and specifically the cultural, educational, and ethnic rights of Jews to find their freedom, to use their language, to teach, and this fight was won based on not just laws, and I'll get back to laws later, but to using the principle to know, that we know and teach, to show the world justice and fairness, and to try to translate these principles into active policies. I don't know how many of you are aware of and familiar with the Lautenberg Amendment. We used the Lautenberg Amendment, which allowed a presumption of persecution, which meant that not every refugee would have to prove that he was a victim of anti-Semitism, but that a whole category of people, Jews, certain Catholic minorities, and certain evangelicals would be presumed to have been fearful of persecution and given advantageous treatment by governments in order to leave the Soviet Union. And this is how we translated the theoretical law into practical policies. And then we are faced today with a lot of statistics. We use these statistics in order to prove that anti-Semitism is a crime or a misdemeanor by certain countries. And at the time, things were very simple. In the Israeli government, we had various agencies who monitored country practices. Some countries are open and have a lot of information, and some countries, whether in North America, in Muslim countries, or in the former Soviet Union, have fewer available statistics. And different agencies use all these facts to try to tabulate where is there anti-Semitism, how is it manifested, and does it go up or down, how does it change comparatively and across the years. And this used to be fairly simple. Everyone who got a report in a cable or in another way, or from the press or otherwise, tabulated these incidents of anti-Semitism according to categories. What are the categories? Obviously murders and violent crimes, press reports, synagogue vandalism, daubing of Jewish cemeteries and others. And then you had the tabulation according to month, according to country, and as statisticians don't know what to do, we had graphs, and then we had pies of anti-Semitism. How many of what color and what type, and now they do use graphs, right, whether the graphs goes up and down. And then I asked myself, what does this tell us? And you come in any international forum, or to the Israeli Knesset. N.K. Nagisa yesterday didn't speak about the many debates in the Knesset on anti-Semitism. And someone comes in and says, last week we had 341 anti-Semitic tweets. Is this a lot of tweets? Is this a few tweets? What does this tell us? So when we are barraged by a lot of statistics, it's not sure how they help us and how we should interpret them and how we should use them. To give you just a couple of examples, a few years ago, there was a young skinhead who walked into the Malaya Bronaya synagogue in Moscow, and there weren't yet good security detection measures at the entrance, and he just shot down whoever was in the hallways of the school, the rabbi's sons and some other students. And this was obviously a violent anti-Semitic murder. And then the police went to his computer, and they found that he had written that he was going to do this, as is the case with many terrorists. And then it became not just this murder which tallied up to 3 victims or 4 victims, but it became his thoughts and who influenced these thoughts and how many others like him were reading him and being influenced by the same people who influenced them. And how do you measure this? And on the other hand, there is a lot of underreporting. When you go to hospitals in Moscow and you see victims of anti-Semitism, and they are extremely religious in their dress, and you ask them what happened, who attacked you, they'll say nobody. And you'll ask, did you report this to the police? Because there's a law against these attacks. And they say no. And why didn't they? Because they want to keep living there, and they want to keep having bring their families there safe, and they're afraid. So where are they in the statistics? So when yes.
We had Zev Khalil here who showed us remarkably low number of attacks in Russia. I think about 30 attacks in the whole Russia. And I, as a person who was born in that area, I know that it's improbable. Definitely, but basically most of them simply are not reported.
To follow that, actually,
Can
yeah, just a second, because it's important. I was also born in Russia, and I agree with what David just said, but what we are trying to say is that people do not report the crimes. The rate of reports is extremely low. It's lower than in usual countries in Europe. Russia is different, somewhat.
Absolutely. So there are various problems of the statistic themselves when you hear them and when you read them. And if we know the statistics, and there are experts on research methods and what to make of this, but we should know that these figures require us to think and to analyze. And are the figures lower than last year's, or higher than last year's, and higher than the next country or the other country, and how should we view this globally? And at the end of the day, since we demand zero tolerance to anti-Semitic crimes, what does it matter how many there are? One is too many, like one child killed. So therefore they have to be viewed with caution. The problems of underreporting that you mentioned are talked about in one of the very important reports of the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU. They have a very thorough report on anti-Semitism, and one of the things that I would like to do, I looked through your bibliographies, I would like to add all the links to all the reports that are available, and they are a rich body of varied literature. And they mention specifically that governments are finally persuaded that their understanding of anti-Semitism is, if anything, is inaccurate and outdated. Jews are unwilling to report anti-Semitic incidents because they believe that criminal justice agencies were unable or unwilling to investigate or prosecute perpetrators. And consequently, some people want to leave, but others want to stay and live in peace, and therefore there is underreporting. There is also over-reporting for various reasons, and I just printed out last night various reports that I can share with you. We have fine agencies in Europe, in the United States, in Israel that tally and produce these reports also in a daily and on a yearly basis. And so you find that countries that report well and take their laws seriously have long chapters, and countries that do not report, where there are serious violations, have short chapters. So then I, as a scientist, as an analyst, what do I make of all this plethora of reports, and how do I understand where the problems are and what there are? And there are other reasons for over-reporting. Many people make a living of anti-Semitism. A justice of the Israel Supreme Court who has just retired, Eliakim Rubinstein, when he was cabinet secretary, called it Shoah business. If you look up the mission statement of Jewish organizations, and I know that you've talked about U.S. and European organizations, they are based on fighting anti-Semitism, and therefore the numbers count and the activities count. So sometimes organizations overplay the actual picture, and there is no need to do that because there is enough to do with the real picture. So all we have to do is know the real situation and work with it and attack where it is needed and point it out where it's needed. And organizations, international organizations, which I deal with, also need to perpetuate themselves, and therefore in other fields we know that UNRWA overrates the number of refugees, and people overrate the number of incidents and of people needed to fight them. And lastly, you've talked about the definition of anti-Semitism, but what are the limits of anti-Semitism? We had an Israeli consul who walked to work in Novosibirsk, and on a mailbox of a private apartment, he saw an A4 paper with a swastika, and somebody had put it out of his printer. So he sent it to the office in Israel, and we tried to see, is this piece of paper a manifestation of anti-Semitism? Because if I have an anti-Semitic thought, it's my private thought. If I print it out and I post it in 1 copy, in 10 copies, if I tweet it in 1 million copies, where are the limits and how am I going to measure this? So one of the research challenges that ISGAP is dealing with is how do we measure the depth and the breadth of anti-Semitism, which is very different from the classical methodology that we more or less learn to deal with. Another problem in the international arena is that countries are mostly willing to fight and oppose anti-Semitism. But in the other country, if you go to Moscow and you want to make a seminar or conference on anti-Semitism, and you have to speak with people, academics and government officials, they will be very willing to hold such a conference. But it should be a conference about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in the United States, in Obama, Trump, but not here at home because we don't really have any. So one is always willing to fight anti-Semitism, but not necessarily at home where the authorities have the ability to deal with this. And there have to be ways to go around it. So what can we do in light of all these problems that I am burdening you with as you finish this course? First of all, we have to know and be aware that there is a lot going on out there, a lot of information, a lot of activity, and it's always good to know what there is and to evaluate and to use the resources that already exist so that we do not have to do the work by ourselves because no organization or scholar is able to do so. There are UN agencies that produce reports. There are EU research bodies and institutions that produce excellent reports, some on attitudes and some on victims and others. I personally like to work with non-UN institutions where there aren't biased majorities to skew the votes and to skew the activities. So I have found the OSCE and its different bodies, ODIHR and others, the democratic institutions, that there you have more of a chance, even though their resolutions and decisions are not binding, of expressing viewpoints, of moving slowly ahead in various areas, like adopting the definition of anti-Semitism. And there are a lot of governmental institutions in each country which also, due to legislation or to their own commitment, produce a plethora of documents. If you go to the Israeli Knesset site, you will find, and Dr. Nagisa didn't mention or have a chance to mention last night, the vast amount of materials and debates and reports which the Israeli Knesset has on this subject. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a debate on anti-Semitism in the United States. Last year, there was a debate on anti-Semitism in Great Britain, and British MPs came to present the picture and to hear questions, and I tried to raise my hand and to talk about the ISGAP Oxford program as something that's being done in England. And it's very important because Knesset records, as opposed to a lot of other seminars and speeches, they are there in perpetuity on record, and they are official documents. So in the Knesset itself, you will find a vast amount of materials that are helpful. If there's a language problem, I am always willing to help and to make available. Some of it is summarized, some of it is very political and annoying, but it gives you a vibrant picture of what's going on. The US government puts out a lot of excellent material. The US Helsinki Commission, the yearly reports of the US State Department on human rights has an excellent system which is now very easy to work with. They put out their yearly reports on human rights performance in different countries, and many years ago we convinced the United States government that anti-Semitism should be a rubric and a subchapter in these reports. And now you can do this online, and you don't have to read this massive document of all these countries. And I pulled out excerpts of anti-Semitism from the 216 US State Department country reports on human rights practices. This surveys 200 countries with which the United States has diplomatic relations, and countries without diplomatic relations but that are involved in this. And I counted, and there are reports on 86 of these countries. My feeling is always, if I can't do something myself, let's see who has the resources and the staff and is on the ground to do it. So there is in every US embassy a human rights officer and a researcher who knows the host country and spends the whole year not only surveying anti-Semitism, but talking to all the NGOs and all the academics who are in that country and are reporting. And then he puts this, he or she, into a document that around the end of the the calendar year goes to the State Department, and then it used to take a month, it now takes 3 or 4 months for the powers that be in the State Department to edit this. And the editing will no doubt be biased according to the political views of the United States government and the diplomatic considerations. Sometimes Chile is higher, and many of you know this better than I do. But this will certainly reflect, if you take a random country, the material that's available, and it says this at the beginning, that some officer has spent hundreds of hours learning and listening to, and it will give you a basis, and it gives you an easy composite picture from which to start. There's always also the religious rights reports of the State Department, which talk about the religious right of the Muslims, of the Jews, of the various Christian sects that are very often discriminated against, and they give you a very good picture of what is going on in any country. And finally, you should ask the professionals. There are various functionaries, some of which have lectured here, but many are not, whose salary is paid for them to know what's happening in anti-Semitism. The United States has at the OSCE a representative for the study of anti-Semitism. It's Rabbi Andrew Baker of the AJC, who many of you know, and he has encyclopedic knowledge of all the meetings and the reports and the issues, and very few of us have the time and the capability of following this in a systematic manner in order to get and to digest this material. And if you ask him, he will tell you what are the peaks for 2016 and the beginning of 2017. There are incredible people like Mike Wine, who you heard last week, I believe, who knows the nitty-gritty of everything that's going on in every European police and other setting. So when I spoke not long ago in Bar Ilan at a conference, I said, Mike, what's going on in the OSCE and in the European institutions? And as a friend, he sent me a 2-page list and links about what's happening. And I said, Mike, thank you, and why don't you write an article on this so that the rest of the world can know without delving into all these monumental documents. And he indeed has already prepared 2 articles. I'm the editor of Justice, a legal magazine put out by the International Association of Jewish Jurists and Lawyers. And there you have a very good composite of what international organizations are doing and not doing, because not everything they do is really effective. Some of them are just meetings and documents. But it will give you that basis, and they will know. Some of the ambassadors, whoever sits in Geneva at the UN institutions, will know in every single UN body and agency what is happening and what is going on. And in Israel, as some of which you heard last night, there are various functionaries and offices that are in charge of knowing and acting on what is going on. Now, not everything is pretty and not everything is simple, because very often you have interagency rivalries and different views. And this is the Middle East, and this is anti-Semitism, and this is part of the healthy discourse, to know everything, to hear everyone. So we have in the Israel Ministry of Diaspora an expert whose job it is to fight anti-Semitism according to Israel government policies. And I asked him, what are the 4 priorities of the ministry in fighting anti-Semitism? And he wrote in translation, reducing incitement to anti-Semitism on the web in cooperation with internet providers, organizations, and governments, fostering education to combat anti-Semitism by means of internet, encouraging progress and acceptance of the definition of anti-Semitism, and developing a standard for unified measuring of anti-Semitism. And so almost every functionary who is paid to monitor and to combat will be able to tell you the priorities so that you have them, and this will give you a global agenda of what is doing what. And with that, and armed with that, you will be empowered to analyze, to teach, to develop your own agenda based on everything that is happening. And I conclude with only praise. The King and Alice said, you know, there was a beginning and an end, and now we've come to an end. And here you are, going out, each of you equipped with everything you've heard, what you've learned, with resources that are available in order to make a difference individually and collectively. I will be glad to speak with you individually, to write, and to assist in any small way that I can in order to make your fight meaningful, and your research and mainly your teaching, and bringing everything that we've done and heard here to generations of students. Thank you.
Thank you, Mama, for a wonderful, provocative, and personally insightful intervention. So I'm going to open it up. Charles is coming, so he's going to resume the seat, and we'll take questions. So just some time for taking the questions.
Anybody? Comments or questions?
I have a question. You mentioned that the Minister of Diaspora has an envoy who fights anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
How does he work with the Department of Combating Anti-Semitism Ministry for Affairs? And why there are so many people on government institutions obviously doing not official, not efficient job?
I think this question was asked last night
And it was not answered.
of Dr. Nagisa, and as I heard him speak, and I'm a great admirer of his, and I don't think you realize, he had the government stuck for several weeks this year. Because they reneged on an agreement to bring 1,800 Ethiopians to Israel, and there were 2 votes in the Likud, his and somebody else's, and he just didn't come to vote. So he froze the entire government until this issue was resolved. So at every meeting that he heads, he says, why doesn't everyone work together? The Israeli government and the Jewish people are very complicated. It comes from vibrancy and very many interests. And there's a coalition agreement that specifies exactly who does what in any current government. You don't have to like it, you don't have to agree, but you sort of have to work with this. So the division is that the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a diaspora division and a anti-Semitism department. And this is the mandate, and they have the power to do a lot of things because they have embassies with functionaries to deal with governments and institutions. The diaspora ministry has a very fine person, and his job is to deal with fighting anti-Semitism. He has a small staff and a considerable budget. The Ministry of Strategic Affairs has a staff of 30 people, a lot of money to fight BDS. There are other agencies, some known, and the most effective ones are unknown. It was said by somebody smart, you have to stand behind your logo, not in front of it. You have to do the work. And this is how I was trained. My name doesn't matter and who I am doesn't matter. It's the result that counts. And these agencies try to work together. No individual functionary likes what's happening, but it is effective. So the money is in one place, the mandate is in another, and they try to work together. I, who have been following this for very many years, since they founded the Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism, can tell you that it works fairly well professionally and diplomatically, and that they try to respect and to work for each other. When the Israeli government first founded the forum, the coordinating forum to fight anti-Semitism, Eliakim Rubinstein, who was the cabinet secretary, said we had 2 advantages. We have no budget and we have no publicity. And everybody came, and it was the table of the government of Israel, which made all diplomats, parliamentarians, and international judges come. It's not an ideal picture, but I can tell you that it works. A lot is being done, and a lot of help is needed by people like yourselves.
Yeah, Lisa would at least buzzer to answer the emails.
Thank you, Yost.
If I may, as someone who was called by the Prime Minister to be the advisor on diaspora affairs, and as a special advisor to the Foreign Minister behind the scene, which not even made public, I can say it here, I beg to differ a bit. Government of Israel is ineffective. And it's ineffective because of politics. Politics, as you very well know, is where money goes. And there's always war on turfs. And that's what it's all about. So, but the divisions in Israel of security and of foreign affairs has been very problematic. The Foreign Affairs Ministry has been diluted, has been broken to several pieces, because there is I would say, I wouldn't say lack of understanding, but lack of appreciation to the domain of foreign affairs in comparison to security, which always trumps everything else. Security trumps everything else, so they don't really put the premium on foreign affairs. And yet, as you say, the issue is there. Lots of things have been done. There's lots of money, and there's also a change of heart. There has been, over the years, a certain division of labor within the Jewish people. The issue of anti-Semitism has been, to some extent, been relegated by the Israeli government to the periphery for many years. It used to be a diaspora issue. And the diaspora used to speak on behalf of the Jews when it came to anti-Semitism. Israelis were not aware, nor did they intend of being aware to the issue, because the ideology of Zionism was anti-Semitism is a fait accompli, you come and live here. We tell you, come to live among ourselves. Don't live abroad. Zionism is all about anti-Semitism. You face anti-Semitism, move to Israel. It's not for us to fight it. And not only that, whenever even Israel had bilateral negotiations, for example, between Begin and Sadat, later on between Ehud Barak and Arafat, or whatever it is, when they came to the idea of dealing with issues of anti-Semitism, the diaspora told them, it's none of your issue. Abe Foxman told Begin, don't touch it. And Begin told Abe Foxman, it will work itself out. We don't need to touch it. It's a bilateral relations. We don't tell Egypt how to deal with issues like that. This have changed, I think, after September 11, when there was a kind of a watershed in terms of understanding what I call the Israelization of anti-Semitism, when anti-Semitism became more imbued with Israel rather than with the Jewish diaspora. This became sort of, and the BDS, of course, is the latest manifestation of that. The fact that we mentioned the BDS so much is because it has rotated there. And that has changed also the minds and hearts of the Israelis. They have appointed for the first time the Minister of Diaspora in 1999. Mr. Malkior was the first one to be there. But it was never empowered enough. But as of late, they understand the gravity of that, especially in support of institutions, the birthright, I think only lately Israelis have started to pay attention to these issues more than they did before. And also because the diaspora component has been weakened in terms of the operational understanding. You mentioned Andrew Baker and the AJC. It used to be a time when they felt they are in the driving seat. Just before September 11, they could go and open up these East European countries that just came to the fore and tell them about memory of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, negotiate. But this has changed also in the last few years. So there is a lot of things that are related to bureaucracy and the shifts in the approach of a sovereign state vis-a-vis the issue which supposedly is not a sovereign state issue, but rather a Jewish people issue. And that's a very important component.
Thanks, yes, Michael.
Thank you. What's the threshold for certain acts or events around the world for agencies to act, and especially Israel, to intervene in taking action?
Well, there is the working definition of anti-Semitism, which I am sure you have studied. Robbie Sable has probably spoken with you about the international law and the weaknesses. And then each country has its own laws, the general penal laws, and where there are specific laws against anti-Semitism and various other manifestations. I didn't address the threshold, but thank you for the question. I would say two things. We fight for countries to adopt legislation, sometimes even where it's not needed. Even in Israel, we have a general penal law which pretty much covers crimes, but then we added specific laws on incitement and others. And we said, our justice ministry said, why do you need these laws? We already have good laws. Sometimes it's the ideological statement that here we are making a special law. And so the international Jewish community and Israel go to different countries and ask them to legislate. We were just in Austria, and the Austrian Ministry of Justice and of Interior is working to adopt laws. Germany has fine laws, and we study the laws of different countries, and there are compendia and there are volumes. And I have two things to say about this. First of all, it's good that there should be laws on the books. On the other hand, you will find that the countries with the best laws are not necessarily the ones that implement them. Because countries that take their laws seriously, like the United States and like Israel, must make sure that they're internal, that they comply with these laws. Whereas others, the best constitution, one of the best was the Stalin Constitution. And Russia has amazing laws. And then they implement these laws, and then the person is imprisoned because he has gone above this threshold. And then 6 weeks later, you go and look what has happened. Well, he was released for lack of public interest, or whatever it's called. So the threshold in every country is the law. The international thresholds are in the international covenants, and the definition to the extent where it will be made into a legal threshold, but in the end it is all very subjective. And that's why I raised these dilemmas of where something private becomes something public and something criminal and something that violates either the norms or the laws. We do stick to this definition because it gives us a certain red line, as they call it.
There is any official explanation why Israel underestimated or started late to take action against BDS?
First of all, I don't sit here as a member of the Israeli government. I worked for the government for many years by choice. It limits you in your freedom, but it empowers you to do amazing things, mainly that you can't talk about. And when the negative goes above the positive, then you have to leave. And I have my own issues, and we all do. But I try to see the positive. Antisemitism is something that has been done in the government of Israel for many years. There was Sharansky, there was no cure, there was one after the other. And again, as long as it was quiet with no money, they did amazing work. And when it became a subject of political turfs, it became a problem. BDS has surfaced lately, and I think we were late. Either Israel didn't detect, or the United States campuses, Israel wasn't aware. When you wake up in Israel at 5 in the morning, they start bombarding you with the news. And every morning there is a crisis. There is never a morning where I wake up and they read you the newspapers as you wake up at 5. There is always a crisis. And BDS is something in France that they're not buying avocados and that they're not letting an Israeli let. So my personal explanation is that in the overall pressure cooker of issues, it was perhaps missed. Or maybe it wasn't missed, it was under the radar, because certain things are better done quietly. But then when you do it quietly, and this is my own criticism, you can't come on behalf of a ministry and say, we do a lot, but we can't tell you about it. So be quiet and say, you can't have it both ways, and they do this consistently. consistently, and this is very annoying, and I do think we have a lot to learn and a lot to prepare for, but the picture is not all negative.
Thank you.
Sorry.
David, a brief question, we have running out of time.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Fascinating and very important. I just have a comment. I live and work for many years in Vilnius, Lithuania, and for the last 9-10 years I've been part of a small NGO, defendinghistory.com, that monitors anti-Semitism.
I know your work
Right.
really well.
And
Yes.
I think Lithuania may be a counterexample on the following, that for political reasons, perhaps very understandable, good political reasons, about 8-9 years ago or 10 years, when we became involved, because it was not my intention to become involved, both the American and Israeli embassies and organizations that are supposed to fight anti-Semitism ended up, in our view, often covering for it, very often by elaborate, very prestigious conferences on anti-Semitism, from which the people who are monitoring and fighting anti-Semitism are completely excluded, because the current politics are, in short, that for the Americans, Lithuania can do no wrong on human rights because it's so important now in the anti-Putin and the anti-Russian alliance. It's on the eastern flank of NATO. Israel, of course, needs the votes of these countries, and needs them very badly in UNESCO, United Nations, European Union, and so forth. So we're in the difficult and unfortunate situation where, may he forgive me, and when Rabbi Baker comes, and we tried to talk to him that it was just a Nazi march yesterday, we tell him, in the middle of the capital, sanctioned by the government, and unfortunately we can't even get it discussed on the agenda of the so-called conferences on anti-Semitism. So in our circles we call them fake anti-Semitism conferences. Anyway, I'd like to conclude by paying tribute to one amazing Israeli diplomat who rose above it all, the late Chen Ivri Apter, who had been ambassador for the Baltic countries in Riga, who showed how a wonderful diplomat can do both, can build the relations that their country needs, make the bigger points, and still keep the table open to what's really happening.
And be courageous. I can tell you that the annals of the Israeli government are thoroughly documented on every single march, every year, and everything in every language is translated and it's there. And then we went to the Israeli foreign minister, not the current one, who is the prime minister, and we brought this material. And the answer was, yes, but we need their vote in the United Nations. And you can take that for what it is. And thank you for your comment. I couldn't agree more.
Thanks. And so we'll take a few more minutes, Larry.
So it seems to me there's two ways, very quickly, there's two ways to win a war. One is to build up your armaments, you have as many armaments as the other person does. The other is to deprive your enemy of the armaments. It seems to me that BDS is working. There must have been huge amounts of public relations, organization, and money in order for BDS. I cannot believe that BDS is a grassroots thing that grew up and took over these things. And the question is, maybe the best way to fight this is to deprive the enemy of its money, because the money has to be coming either from states, from sovereign states, Saudi Arabia or other places, in which they could be publicly embarrassed about this, or the money comes from donations to terrorist-style or terrorist-supporting organizations. So both these flows of money are internationally, at the very least, internationally embarrassing. And this is what's keeping BDS alive. So I'm wondering if enough is being done to deprive them of arms rather than just our building up our counter-arms.
A very strategic thinking, follow the money, is both in the fight against terrorism and against BDS and others. This is the source, because the others, otherwise they have no stay. I once went
So this is being done?
This is being done, whether in the right amount, I cannot tell you, but certainly by experts. And the question is a question of effectiveness. I was once in Chicago in one of those windy, freezing days, and there were placards by students against Israel, against everything. And I said, how are these people standing here in the cold? And then it was explained to me, these are students who are being paid. So the question is not who's standing, but who's paying them.
Yeah.
And that's the name of the game.
And I also want to make a brief comment. You talked about how in the Soviet Union or Russia, they will look at anti-Semitism in other places. And how, you also mentioned how some Jewish organizations compete and some are sort of maybe overestimating anti-Semitism for their own purposes. And I know organizations that actually do very little or if anything on issues of anti-Semitism, but they'll do campaigns to raise money to fight anti-Semitism. They're not even really engaged in the issue, which is amazing. But I also think, and I turn to this room as scholars, and I think as scholars that we're in a very important position where we can take these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective and study it conceptually, to look at economic, social, cultural processes, and to also look at this issue empirically. And, you know, it's not the same, Russia's not the same as the United States of America, you know, for many reasons, but as a sort of a comment to think about. We worry about anti-Semitism, and the United States is a champion of democracy in the free world and fights anti-Semitism, and yet I keep thinking how the previous administration literally aided and abetted Islamist extremists in the Sunni and the Shiite world, and history will bear this out. I'm sure history will bear this out in a very detailed manner. And there's 2 arms deals that have been done with regimes that call for the extermination of Jews. Mainly $350 billion in aid and military aid and business was sent to Saudi Arabia recently by the Trump administration. And up to approximately $100 to $150 billion of deals and corporate deals in bringing Iran back into the family of nations. And Iran is a regime that also calls for the extermination of Jews and is doing tremendous damage in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, as we speak. So I think these are important things, and scholars, we have the luxury and the time and the space to really engage in serious research to understand what's happening in processes. And I think if scholars do good work, and if ISGAP is doing anything well as a research center or as a space where we kind of, you know, sit as scholars, professors, teachers to deal with these issues, then we really have the independence and space to create research that hopefully will have an impact on the non-governmental organizations, on the Jewish community, on the human resource community, the human rights community, and perhaps some of us who are engaged in policy will have an impact on policy. But there's something happening when the Iran deal went through and Siemens and Boeing are making huge sales as a result. And the same is happening in Saudi Arabia. As scholars, I think we need to understand and unpack these processes and see how, in many instances, short-term benefits, corporate benefits and political benefits and geostrategic benefits are short-term, and the cost to average people around the world, and also to the cost of allowing anti-Semitism to sort of cook and spread is something that we need to document as scholars and thinkers, and hopefully have a positive impact on these situations. So on that note, Mala, thank you very much for